Week 4 of NWBA Season 7 and things are really starting to heat up. Hardhome in desperate need of a big win, could Ball Heat find that and regain a little bit of pride at the same time by knocking off Nico and the New Moon Darkrise? Sirchester has been on a heater since the first week of the season. Can they exact a measure of revenge against Sunny Shore, who knocked them off in that first week? Kobe and Logan have been going back and forth since the beginning of the NWBA. Who will take the victory in their latest installment? And is this finally the week where somebody's able to take down Ambertown? Find that out and more. Week 4 of Wonder Room coming up next. Wonder Room is brought to you in part by Booze Mobile and by Kurtz's Chicken. And now for your host, King Vasser. Hello everybody and welcome back to Wonder Room. We are 4 weeks into the season, which means we are entering the final stretch very soon. The back third of the season where teams really start to lock in and gear towards that playoff push. The trade deadline has passed and there were a lot of impactful trades we will go over later today. But for the first time all season, there are no important news regarding faction operations or GM changes or anything like that. Gives us a little bit of a reprieve from what we normally have to announce in Wonder Room in Season 7. So with that, we can go straight to the set highlights for this week. Now, when you ask people what they think the most important week of the season is, typically they're going to answer with Week 6, and it makes a lot of sense. It's the last week of the season. The playoff picture is more clear than it is at any other point in the season. Teams know exactly what they need to do to get into the playoffs or to get a certain seed, what have you. But all things considered, Week 4 is arguably the single most important week of the entire season. It happens in the back half of the season when you really have an idea of what players are, what their tendencies are, how good they actually are. The teams typically have a better grasp on how to fight them and especially how to play as them. And you have to consider that Week 4 is a run back of Week 1, which means it's all intra-league matchups. So these are the more important matchups on the season. And so as a result, Week 4 has the opportunity to really have the biggest impact on the standings towards the end of the season. And as such, there were a lot of really high-profile matchups that took place in Week 4. New Moon and Hardhome, Nico famous, or rather infamously said that this is not a rivalry, and you can't blame him for having that thought process. Ball Heat has never beaten Nico in a set before. Obviously, everyone knows about the now infamous diss track that Ball Heat dropped last playoffs, and never got to meet Nico in the playoffs to find out if he would win or not. And in their first matchup this season, Nico dispatched him on primetime fairly easily. So with all that being said, is this really a rivalry? Can we say that for certain? Would Ball Heat have a definitive answer in his rematch versus Nico? Sirchester, one of the best teams in the league, especially after Week 1. Sunny Shore, a team that is fighting for a playoff spot. Things have been looking up as of recently for Zach and his coach Dom. But with one of the best teams in the league on their plate this week, would they be able to withstand that storm and get a crucial W in a heated Ruby League wildcard race? Elsewhere in the Sapphire League, you've got Mauville and Humalau, two teams, again, fighting for important playoff positioning. Humalau coming into the week as the 5, Mauville as the 3, and Kobe and Logan, two of the original NWBA veterans. What would their newest installment of games look like, considering that Mauville barely edged out Humalau 2-1 at the beginning of the season? And then lastly, we got Ambertown and Mount Coronet. Ambertown, of course, still undefeated coming into the week. It has been rough sledding for a lot of teams trying to take down Aliv's team, especially that's a Titan. But one of the teams that got as close as anybody to winning was Mount Coronet when they played Week 1. Would Earthlax be able to make the important adjustments necessary to finally end the greatest season-starting undefeated streak in NWBA history? New Moon and Hardhome, big matchup here in the Sapphire League and a lot of pride on the line. Right out the gate, you see that Clodsire is in fact water absorbed to help stymie Keldeo, and then reveals it as liquidation as coverage. Interesting decision there from Ball Heat at the team builder. Turn 4, Superior able to get a double switch substitute, and then glares the Salamence, which does come packing with the Air Slash. We've seen special Salamence come through all season for Ball Heat, and it's able to take out the Superior early on. Overcoil comes in, immediately goes for the SD, and that Crunch is doing a decent amount to the Fortress. Unfortunately, gonna get T-Wave there. But Ball Heat deciding not to try to get a better situation, instead getting up the hazards, and then goes for a little bit of chip on the Overcoil with the lunge and help lower its attack before it finally goes down on turn 11 to another Crunch. So in comes the Salamence back to start air slashing things, but both Pokemon get paralyzed, and paralysis was a big story in this matchup. Salamence Dragon Tailing out the Overcoil after the Gunk Shot, but the Keldeo has Icy Wind in the back, locked and loaded, so Salamence is going to go down there. In comes Mudsdale to take a Poison Jab from Clodsire, so you see multiple attacks coming out from Clodsire. Again, interesting decision. We'll understand just how important that could be for Ball Heat later on. Samurott able to get off of Ceaseless Edge, Mudsdale getting off the rocks as well. But as Samurott continues going for Ceaseless Edges, the Mudsdale stamina defense boosts are really starting to come through. Gets rid of Samurott with that body press. Infernape's gonna have to come in and take care of Mudsdale with the Grass Knot. So now Darkrai comes in, forges, takes a Psy Shock, does a healthy 40%. Overcoil comes back in, takes a lot of hazard damage, and Forge is able to get a lot of HP back thanks to that Draining Kiss. And because Overcoil is paralyzed, it's going to be slower. So Forge is now up to a healthy percent after taking out the Overcoil. Clodsire comes in on the Rotom, takes a discharge, and then Will-O-Wisp miss. And now the Liquidation is starting to be a little useful, but now that this thing is burned, it's not going to be doing anywhere near as much. A few turns later, after some more back and forth between Clodsire and Rotom, Darkrai comes in, but so does Infernape, and it's able to get the KO with the Vacuum Wave as Rotom heat switches in. Clodsire is going to be able to come in on the Keldeo, has to take 2 Secret Swords, but that's fine. You know that this thing is going to be choiced. Forge is going to be able to come in, and thanks to all that hazard chip and the fact that both Pokemon left are weak to fairy moves, Forge is going to be able to pick up a nice victory in game 1 thanks to Draining Kiss. Doesn't get the KO on Keldeo immediately, but it's not going to matter. You see the Hydro Pump's only doing 20%. So a good game 1 win coming out for Hearthome. Start of game 2, Infernape and Overcoil the leads. Infernape just gets out of dodge immediately with the U-turn. Fortress comes in on the spikes from Overcoil, reveals that it's Rapid Spin, but of course you have to play the game of letting Mudsdale get its defense boost up. Salamence comes in, the double to Jirachi, and then as Samurott switches it on that, you see the Terra Fairy Calm Mind come out. Dazzling Gleam takes Samurott off the map, and you know what time it is. But this is why Poison Jab on Clodsire is proven to be so important. Gets a lot of damage on Jirachi and the poison. So now after a second Poison Jab, Jirachi in dire straits. Fortress comes in to take the stored power. Ball Heat just trying to spread out as much HP as possible before Jirachi goes down. Fortress doesn't take much of anything, and so Jirachi goes down on turn 9 thanks to the poison. Superior comes in, Salamence back to try to deal with this thing. And this time, Nico misses the Leech Seed immediately, so instead he swaps back out into Overquill, takes a decent chunk from the Air Slash. But he goes back into Fortress on the SD. We've already seen how this interaction played out before, and it's going to play out in much a similar way. Ballhy going for the lunge immediately to get a little bit more longevity on the Fortress. Able to get up hazards as well as a result, because it was able to live the second crunch before finally going down to a third one. Infernape comes in to revenge KO and reveals the overheat, so this thing is most likely Specs, gets the KO. Mudsdale comes back in, sets up hazards itself, and then Darkrai comes in on Salamence, but good Dragon Tail there from Ball Heat. So now Keldeo has to come out. Clodsire comes back in, but Nico smartly goes for a Secret Sword, so Clodsire is going to go down after a second one. Forge just has to come in to revenge KO. Mudsdale comes in, doesn't take much of anything from Draining Kiss. You see the defense boost come out again. In comes Salamence to deal with this thing, and you see Heavy Slam come out as coverage. So Forge is not safe from this Mudsdale, but Salamence isn't that much either. Its Air Slashes aren't doing that much. You see the Citrus Berry come out and then reveals the Roost right after. So Citrus Berry and Roost, but you see how much that body press is doing when Salamence goes for a Roost. And now with Mudsdale at +3 defense, body press is doing more than enough to keep Salamence reasonably low after roosting. And so, on turn 31, Ball Heat realizes this is a losing battle, just goes for the Dragon Tail. Salamence now at 11%. Superior comes back in and is able to Leaf Storm for free to pick up the KO on Salamence. Infernape comes in, and now you know for a fact this thing is Specs because it's slower than the Superior. U-turns out into Florges. That thing gets paralyzed as well. Draining Kiss not enough to KO the Superior, so it's going to get off a little bit more chip before finally going down to the Florges Draining Kiss. In comes Mudsdale. You already know what coverage this thing has, but Nico smartly reads the Infernape switch and gets the KO with the EQ, and is able to just heavy slam the Forges right after to take back the set with a Game 2 victory. We move to Game 3, Infernape and Darkrai the leads. Nico immediately going for the Psyshock, so Forges able to come in on that, get off rocks. Salamence comes in on Mudsdale, it gets up rocks. So now hazards are up. Salamence immediately Dragon Tailing out the Mudsdale. We've learned from Game 2 interaction. Overcoal comes in, Fortress comes in on that as Nico starts setting up spikes. But of course, this Fortress is locked and loaded with Rapid Spin. We've already seen it. So Ball Heat able to clear the hazards. Mudsdale comes back in, so it's at +1. And on turn 11, after some more back and forth, Jirachi's able to come in on a Florges. So now Cloudsire's going to have to come in. Nico's going to start Calm Minding again. Doesn't Terra out the gate, which Ball Heat correctly predicts, so he gets off a lot of damage with the EQ. But he doesn't guess right on the turn after. Nico going for the stored power and tearing to Fairy. Ball Heat not able to get up enough damage thanks to having to press EQ and not Poison Jab. Clodsire goes down, and then Nico reveals that he is in fact Wish stored power Jirachi. We've seen this pay off massively for Nico last season, and it's looking pretty dire at this juncture in the third game. Florges comes in on the paralyzed Jirachi, but it's not going to be able to do anything after this thing's already boosted up multiple times. And you see the Terra Steel Terra Blast isn't doing anything to this Jirachi either. So now on turn 24, Jirachi is at +6 in both categories. Florges able to get the drop with the Moonblast and then a second consecutive drop, but it's not going to matter. Jirachi more than enough to pick up the KO. Infernape comes in and it's looking all over for Heart Home. The first overheat not doing anything as Jirachi gets paralyzed. And then the second overheat gets the crit somehow, some way. Ball Heat gets the luck he needs and he is back in the set. So Mudsdale comes in, gets off rocks, gets a body press on the Salamence, gets Dragon Tailed again. Ball Heat not messing around with this Mudsdale interaction. Superior comes out on the Dragon Tail again. Unfortunate there for Ball Heat. Glare gets the full para and then a second full para. So now Superior able to get up Lead Seed as well. Salamence breaks the sub, so he's gonna have to switch into Infernape after. Nico behind the sub again, gets off the Glare with Infernape, but Ball Heat able to U-turn out into Fortress. Superior goes back behind the sub as Ball Heat goes for Rapid Spin to clear the rocks. So now this thing is getting paralyzed as well. Everybody on Heart Home getting the yellow color from Superior. Unfortunately, the full para does not come through on turn 37, so Nico just gets up the Lead Seed before Superior goes down. But Ball Heat wisely Rapid Spinning to clear Lead Seed off of Fortress, so Superior gets handled. Even though a lot of mons are paralyzed, Ball Heat will take that. Salamence comes in on the Mudsdale, gets the Air Slash, and then flinches it, and then gets a big crit on turn 41. So knowing that he can outpace this Mudsdale at this juncture in the battle, tries to get the KO, unfortunately gets full parried on turn 42, and then again on turn 43, so Nico able to get off a lot of chip on the Salamence. Turn 44 Ball, he goes for the Roost, knowing that the Mudsdale at +2 is going to do a decent amount, but not enough to offset it, and then finally pick up the KO with the Air Slash on Mudsdale. So Darkrai comes in, gets the Revenge KO with Dark Pulse, in comes Raikou, goes straight for the Volt Switch, so you see that this thing is scarfed faster than the Darkrai. Darkrai goes for a Dark Pulse again, gets off a lot of damage on the Fortress and able to pick up the KO right after. Raikou comes back in and gets the KO on Darkrai with the Volt Switch, but you see it's taking a lot of hazard damage. So Infernape comes in on Overquill, gets off a Vacuum Wave, Gunk Shot not enough to get the KO, and Infernape doesn't get parried on the second turn either. So Vacuum Wave picking up a ton of damage on this Overquill, more than enough for Raikou to pick up the KO. And so now it's all down to a virtually full health Keldeo, who does live the Thunderbolt, but low rolls on the Hydro Pump. And so Raikou picks up the KO, Ball Heat by the skin of his teeth. Call it luck, call it divine intervention, whatever you want to say it. What you can call it is a Heart Home victory over New Moon, the first in Ball Heat's career over Nico. Big day from Infernape. Raikou with 3 KOs, no deaths off the bench, moves to 5-7 while New Moon drops to 9-4. Sirchester and Sunny Shore were the first time these two teams met. It took place on Sunday through mobile showdown, so you can kind of throw that one away. This is the first time these two teams are really getting to battle under proper circumstances. And out the gate, Blades immediately setting up with Iron Thorns, picks up a quick KO on Skarmory after 2 Supercell slams. Araquanid comes in, reveals that it is Focus Sash, so it gets Iron Thorns out the paint. But after just 5 turns, Zach's defense is essentially completely gone. Tornadus comes in on an Amorous to block, and Earth Power goes immediately for the taunt. Zach not interested in going for Calm Mind, just goes straight for the Mystical Fire. Torn reveals that the Enamorous is in fact Boots and not AV, but not gonna matter too much at the end of the day. Blitzing comes in on the Draining Kiss, takes a decent chunk, but is able to do a lot of damage with that Flare Blitz, but it's not gonna pick up the KO, so Enamorous gonna be able to take out Blaziken there. Tornadus comes back in, the Hurricane lands, and Enamorous Theory goes down. Now it's time for Palmont to get things shaken. Tornadus U-turns out, and then Zach goes for Revival Blessing instead, so immediately brings Skarmory back in, and then goes right into Skarmory on the Endeavor. So Blade's trying to do a lot of damage thanks to Endeavor and Endure and whatnot, but instead Zach gets Skarmory up to full, gets off a layer of spikes after the Rapid Spin, gets off a second layer, and then on the impending taunt goes straight for the Brave Bird. So Zach, playing the first game pretty well, takes a Hurricane from Tornadus T, still able to get through and hit the Brave Bird. Hitmontop comes back in after Tornadus gets fairly low. Zach reads it with the switch to Palmont, double shot comes out, Hitmontop goes down. In comes Roaring Moon, reveals that it's Booster. It's going to be enough to knock off the ban from the Palmont, take care of Skarmory, and so things are getting dicey here in the late game. Greninja goes for the Ice Beam, it's not going to pick up the KO. Blade's going for the knock, revealing that the Greninja is Expert Belt, wanted the information more so than anything else, so the Greninja going to be able to get off the Battle Bond, but it's not going to KO defensive Ogerpon, so Greninja goes down to the Ivy Cudgel. Gengar gonna be able to pick up the KO with the Shadow Ball, gets knocked off, lives it, gets off the Sludge Wave, but it doesn't KO either, so Tornadus lands the Hurricane. Blade somehow, by the skin of his teeth, wins the first game. On to game 2, Araquanid the immediate lead, and a good liquidation on the Blaziken pressing U-turn. Tornadus lands yet another Hurricane, so Araquanid is gonna go down. Weezing comes in, it was the swap for Hitmontop. Reveals that it has Thunderbolt for coverage, so it hits an Amorous T for a good chunk before Iron Thorn comes in on an impending Mystical Fire. So now Blades goes for the Terra, gets off the Dragon Dance, gets the Stone Edge, but doesn't get the crit, so Palmont's gonna be able to pick up the KO with the Double Shock. Tornadus comes back in and just revenge KOs the Palmont with the knockoff. Greninja comes in, gets off an Ice Beam. It does a lot to Ogerpon, but Zach not going immediately for the Battle Bond, wanting to save it for a late game situation. Instead, Skarmory comes in and Brave Bird's on the Ogerpon taunt. So Zach has now outplayed that interaction twice as Blitzing comes in to get the revenge KO with the Flare Blitz. So now the speed boost goes up. Greninja comes in and reveals that it has Water Shuriken. So Blaziken getting caught by surprise. Now it's time for Battle Bond to activate. Weezing comes in, takes 51 from a Surf, and crucially misses the Strange Steam. So now Greninja's going to pick up a second KO. In comes Roaring Moon. Ice Beam gets the crit, so Roaring Moon goes down, and so Greninja is going to be able to sweep here in game 2. And so now we head to the third game. Araquanid the lead again, and this time Tornadus finally misses. With that going straight for the Sticky Webs, but Weezing still on the field, so going to be able to get off a Defog. Tries to get a read with the Will-O-Wisp, but misses an Amorous. Has to go for a Defog after the Mystical Fire, so Tornadus comes back in. Zach stays in, continues to Mystical Fire. Now Greninja comes in, but takes a lot from the U-turn, and in comes Ligget H, which was another swap. Does 51% to the Skarm, that's a lot of damage, but you know how Hustle works, and crucially Ligget misses the second CC, so Skarmy gets back up to near full, and then starts Brave Birding, does a good chunk to Tornadus. Enamorus comes back in, gets knocked off, that's fine. Hazards haven't gone up on Blade's side, so it doesn't really matter. Mystical Fire comes out again, and it really is pretty good for almost any mon in the field. And then Zach reads a Leech Seed from Ogerpon and hits the KO with the Mystical Fire. So now Iron Thorns comes in, tears again, but this time Zach doesn't predict it correctly. Blade's tearing immediately every single time, and the third time proves to be very crucial as it blocks an Earth Power. And after a Draining Kiss, Enamorus T goes down to a Stone Edge. Arachnid comes in, gets hit with the Supercell Slam, and then reveals that it does in fact have Endeavor. And then Blade's thinking that Zach might get a little greedy on this turn, goes for the taunt to stop webs, but instead Zach just goes for the KO, gets knocked out by the Tornadoes, but at this point the Iron Thorns is out. Palmod is in, it's time to start double shocking again. Weezing goes down, outspeeds the Lilligant crucially, so Lilligant goes down. Roaring Moon comes in, goes straight for the DD, takes a healthy chunk from the double shock before finally going down, or finally taking out Palmod with the knockoff. It's not going to do enough damage to KO the Skarmy, so Skarmy's going to be able to pick up the KO thanks to the Brave Bird and Rocky Helmet chip, and now it's just down to Tornadus, and it can't pick up the KO with Hurricane, so it takes a healthy amount of chip before Skarmy goes down to Recoil. Gengar lives the knock, does more than enough with the Sludge Wave for the Water Shuriken to pick up the victory, and it's not even going to matter Blades awarding the KO to Gengar. And so Sunny Shore, for the second time this season, gets a very big upset win over Sir Chester. Greninja and Palmot combining for 9 KOs. 17 out of 18 possible in a victory. Good effort from Sir Chester. Still sitting pretty at 9-4-1, but it was not enough to even the season series against Sunny Shore. Important Sapphire League matchup between Mauville and Humalao. Flygon out the gate, immediately going for the Dragon Dance. Obviously, the Vikavolt is going to go straight for the Sticky Web, so Flygon's going to be able to get up to +2 here, and immediately Terra Steals to stop any Moonblast shenanigans from Gardevoir. And you see the Fire Punch come out as coverage, so now Kobe going to have to sack Vikavolt, bring in Mienshao. Earthquake pops the Sash, so it is in fact Sash Mienshao, picks up the KO with close combat, but Flygon immediately taking almost 3 Mons out the paint. Talonflame comes in, immediately gets rid of webs. So it's a great start for Mauville. You see the Dawn Fan come out with the Smackdown coverage to smoke Talonflame. Golden Ghost switches in on an Ogerpon Hornleech. So Talonflame's got to come back in. Kobe going straight for the Make It Rain. Does a healthy amount, but obviously Golden Go in danger. Logan reads the switch, goes for another U-turn. Ogerpon back in. Kobe figures he's just got to try to chip this thing as much as possible, but Hornleech doing a lot to Donphan, so Ogerpon's gonna be able to stay relatively healthy, picks up the KO with the knockoff, so now Golden Go's gonna have to come back in. Logan reads that Kobe goes for Shadow Ball and not Make It Rain, so he's able to get off a layer of spikes. Talonflame comes in, lives the Shadow Ball, and then gets the KO with the Flare Blitz before going down itself. So now Gardevoir comes in with Zamazenta. Gardevoir pretty much dead anyway, reveals that it is Scarfed. That's going to be important information for later as Gardevoir goes down to the Psychic Fangs from Zamazenta. So in comes Valiant, gets the KO with the Moonblast, but at this point, can't do that much to Basque Legion. Nock does a healthy chunk, but nowhere near enough. Surf takes out the Valiant. Mienshao's got to go for something miraculous. Doesn't get a crit on the triple axle, so it goes down to another Surf, and that's game 1 for Mauville. On to game 2, Mienshao and Ogerpon the leads. Mienshao gets off a quick fake out. Takes a lot of damage from the Hornleech, but is going to be able to put Ogerpon into sturdy range thanks to the CC. Swaps right into Golden Go, going to be able to live that Hornleech quite easily. So now Golden Go's got a bit of an advantage here. Goes straight for the Shadow Ball, gets 50% on Talonflame. Logan goes straight for the Flare Blitz again. This time Donphan able to eat it up. So Talonflame below half, U-turns out into Legion on the Smackdown. So now the problem is here. But Kobe reads that Logan's going to go straight for Flip Turn and gets the rocks up. Talonflame's going to be able to defog away, but has to die to a Smackdown in return. So now Ogerpon comes back out. Horn Leeches again on the Golden Ghost, still not getting that much HP back, but it is going to be faster. It's going to take care of the Golden Go with the knock. Gardevoir comes back in to revenge, gets off the Psychic, takes care of Ogerpon. In comes Flygon. You know you have to worry about the Terra Steel, which does come out. Logan goes for the Dragon Dance, but Kobe, switching right into Valiant on it, is able to get off an Encore, and then CCs the Flygon for all of its health. So really good play there by Kobe. Now he's in a very good position, up 5-3. Moonblast has a healthy amount to the Zamazenta, and then Valiant lives the Psychic Fangs with 1%. So Moonblast is going to take Zamazenta out and get a nice crit on the Zapdos before finally going down to a Heat Wave. So Gardevoir is going to be able to come in. Basket Legion is the switch in, but it's not going to be able to take 2 Moonblast. It goes down, and so Humalo answers back in Game 2 in a huge way. We move to Game 3. Legion the lead right out the gate and immediately smokes Golden Go. No time for predicting. We're just going to hit what's in front of us, and it pays off. So now Donphan's going to have to come in, takes a lot of damage from the Shadow Ball, gets off a good amount with the EQ. But Basket Legion more than content to just take another Shadow Ball, and because Kobe was predicting a switch, he gets rocks up, but now Donphan's going to have to go down. So Basket Legion getting a lot of damage off before Moonblast from Gardevoir finally takes care of it. Ogerpon comes in. Mienshao comes in and gets knocked, so the sash has been removed. Mienshao just fakes out just to get a little bit of chip on this Ogerpon, but it's not going to be able to live a Horn Leech, so Ogerpon back up to full, and Mienshao goes down. Gardevoir comes in and Moonblast. It does a good amount, but not that much. Gets knocked, and so Ogerpon outspeeds again, gets off the Horn Leech. It's up to Valiant and Azumarill now. Valiant able to pick up the KO with the CC, but at this juncture, there's a lot left on the side of Mauville. Whimsicott comes in, lives the Moonblast, takes out Iron Valiant with the Energy Ball, and while it does go down to the Azumarill Aqua Jet, Zapdos is going to be able to come in, get off a lot of damage with that Volt Switch. Ozra's going to be able to heal up with the Citrus Berry and get off the Belly Drum, but at this point, it has to be able to take out a full Zapdos and a full Zamazenta, and it's not going to be able to take out the Zapdos. So after the Flygon KO, Zapdos comes in, eats it up, gets the KO with Volt Switch, and so Mauville moves to 8-4-1 on the season, now on a 3-set win streak. Big days from Ogerpon and Basket Legion Female. Good effort from Humala, which answered back with Gardevoir and Iron Valiant, but unfortunately they dropped to 5-7 on the season. Ambertown and Mount Coronet, a very close battle, the first time these two opponents met. So the rematch, definitely high stakes, interesting to see what's going to happen here. So Titan coming out early, pressing the Terra Water and belly drumming on turn 3. Aleph has gotten a lot of mileage out of just letting Titan do its thing early on, and it nets a KO early in this battle. Ice Shard comes through, Conkeldurr has to get off a raw close combat with no Guts boost, so Titan's going to be able to pick up a second KO immediately after. In comes Kiram, goes straight for the scale shot, so Titan's going to be able to go down, but already takes 2 Mons. However, 2 sets of hazards up on the field, not looking too terrible for Mount Coronet. Lucario comes in, Meteor Mashes on a Tatsugiri switching, gets the attack raise, so the extreme speed is going to be able to put it away. You see the Life Orb chip coming through, Glassword coming back out, outspeeds Lucario, picks up the KO with the Earthquake. In comes Como, able to take a Facade, and immediately goes for the Clangorous Soul. So the second huge setup sweeper is gonna come out on the field, takes care of Gliscor with the Clanging Scales, and from here it's gonna be an Ambertown victory. Almost disaster when Aleph accidentally presses the wrong move, but still outspeeds the Torterra after the Shell Smash. Kiram gonna have to go down as well, and that is a very quick and decisive game 1 for Ambrit. On to game 2, Kiram and Lucario the leads, Earthwax switching out, Gliscor able to take the CC very easily. And so Alex got to go into Tentacool, Earthwax reads it with the EQ, Tentacool goes down immediately. In exchange, you give hazards on turn 3 before Dragapult comes in. A second layer of spikes sets up for Gliscor. And you see the banded Dragon Darts come out from Dragapult, going to do a healthy chunk of damage. Earthquake stays in to go for the double protect, ends up getting the switch out, so a free Earthquake coming through. Como has to come in and take that. And then takes a second Earthquake, so now Como cannot Clangorous Soul. Earthquake's figuring that it would be smarter to just EQ rather than try to protect. And so So Titan's going to have to come in after Como goes down, finally gets Gliscor out the paint with the Icicle Crash, but now this thing is at +0, it's below half HP, and when you're going to miss Icicle Crash, it's going to be even worse. Conkeldurr gets off the knock, now the Guts is activated, reads the switch in, knocks off the Dragapult, revealing that it's banned and getting the KO. Gastrodon has to come in, does not die from the facade, and you see the Rocky Helmet, so Gastrodon going to be able to get off a lot of good chip on this Conkeldurr. It's gonna go down to the second facade, but that's more than enough for Titan to pick up the KO with the Ice Shard. But you see how much damage this thing is taking thanks to the 2 layers of spikes. Now Titan cannot come back in. Lucario gets hit with a Surf, does a lot of damage, is able to pick up the KO with the CC. But at this juncture, Lucario's only gonna be able to get off one more move before it goes down to Life Orb chip. It's not gonna matter anyway. Kyurem picks up the KO with the Icicle Spear, and thanks to the hazards, that's game 2 for Mount Coronet. Kyurem once again the lead for game 3, and Earthlight gets right to business with the Dragon Dance. Aleph stays in, sets up hazards, and is going to be able to live the Icicle Spear, so it sets up a spike as well. So now 2 layers of hazards over for Amber Town side as Gastrodon finally goes down. Lucario goes straight for the E-Speed, gets some good chip. Gonna have to take the Icicle Spear from the Kyurem, doesn't get the KO, but tries to switch out to read something. Instead, Earthlight staying in again. Now Como goes down. Tentacle comes in, and Aleph finally gets the scale shot that he's looking for, but it only costs half the team. Lucario go for the E-Speed, and it's still not enough, only 47%. So Kyurem picks up a 4th KO. It finally puts Kyurem into range of an Ice Shard rather, but now things are looking pretty dire for Amber Town. Dragon Ball comes in, takes the Thunder from the Galvantula. Empoleon comes in. Aleph reads that with a U-turn, so Titan comes back in. Goes for the Terra Water, goes straight for the Belly Drum. This has to be the avenue to win. Earthlight is trying to get as much chip as possible. Goes for the Flash Cannon. It's not going to do anywhere near enough as Empoleon goes down to the EQ. In comes Torterra. Terra rocks to not die to the Ice Shard. Doesn't matter. Aleph knows that he had to go for Icicle Crash and gets bullet seeded, so now it's just down to Dragapult. But you see how much damage these Dragon Darts are doing. Gliscor taking 70% from that. So he's got, Earthlight has to protect as much as possible to try to stall this thing out and maybe get enough HP to live Dragon Darts, but it's not going to matter. That's going to take care of Gliscor. Galvantula comes in, and thanks to all that hazards, it easily goes down to Dragon Darts. And now all of a sudden, it looks as if Dragon Darts Banded Dragapult is going to be able to pick up the victory after taking out Torterra. Does 42 in the first hit, but low rolls the second. So Conkeldurr, by the skin of its teeth, picks up the final KO. Amber Town's undefeated streak finally snapped, 12-1 on the season. Massive win for Mount Coronet, who moves to 6-5-1 on the season. Big days from Kyurem, Gliscor, and Conkeldurr. It took a lot, and it was only by 2%. But Earthflax and Mount Coronet, the victor over the previously undefeated Amber Town Auroras. Now we move to our By the Numbers segment of this week's episode. Of course, with week 4 being as impactful as it always tends to be, you finally get a notable amount of clarity in the standings. But of course, we've got the Pokemon of the week and such to go through. An interesting week for sure, given that it was a shorter week than most, but nonetheless, still a very important and impactful one for Season 7. Things starting to get a little bit interesting over in the Ruby League. Amber Town still sits at the number 1 spot, but they sit at 12-2 now, losing not only to Mount Coronet, but getting upset by Sunyshore in the process. So now their chances of breaking the record for best win percentage in a 16-team season is done. They can still match the record if they win out for the rest of the season, but their chances at 21-1 are no longer possible. Sirchester still sits at number 2 at 9-4-1. They also went 1-2 in the week, also getting upset by Sunyshore. So they weren't really able to gain any ground on Amber Town, and now they have lost the head-to-head tiebreaker with them in the process. It's going to be really hard for them to snatch the 1 seed without Amber Town fumbling down the stretch. Mount Coronet still sits at the number 3 spot at 7-6-1 after going 2-1 on the week. while Koroway sits at number 4 at 6-7-1. Notably, they lost the head-to-head matchup with Mount Coronet, so that is a pretty big matchup decider right there, deciding who has to play in the wild card and who gets to avoid that matchup. So it's going to be really interesting watching Mount Coronet and Koroway in the last 2 weeks of the season. But of course, there's still a lot of contention in the wild card spots at all. Sicily now sits at the number 5 spot in the Ruby League at 6-8 after going 3-0 on the week, including a big head-to-head win over Sunny Shore, as well as a head-to-head win over Veilstone. Sunny Shore also sits at 6-8. Of course, they had those 2 huge upsets on the week, but by losing to Sicily, they now have been swept in the regular season by them. So Sicily holds that head-to-head tiebreaker for the remainder of the season. And with both of those teams sitting at the same record, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there down the stretch. Veilstone still hanging in there at 5-9, but after a pretty unfortunate 1-2 week, they now are kind of on the outside looking in. Of course, there are still 8 sets left to be played, so plenty of time to make some moves. Technically, they could go as high up as the number 3, realistically. But for now, Veilstone on the back foot, trending downwards compared to the rest of the Ruby League playoff contenders. Black City, unfortunately, went winless again this week. They are now on an 8-set losing streak, now sitting at 3-11. The relegation match is looking more and more likely by the week. Still some time to turn things around, but it's looking grim for the Pawniards. As far as the Sapphire League is concerned, it's starting to get really interesting at the top of the board. New Moon still holds on to that number 1 spot at 10-4. They went 2-1 on the week, including big wins over Kitakami and Mistralton. Mauville, however, is creeping. They have moved up to number 2 after a perfect 3-0 week. Mauville on a 4-set win streak and now sit at 9-4-1, just half a game behind New Moon. So their impending rematch is going to be massive for Sapphire League playoff implications. Kitakami at 9-5 moved down to number 3, still a very good record, but after a 1-2 week, they are in danger of losing their spot on a top 3 seed. Remember that they did lose to Mistralton earlier in the season, so with that team being the closest to them, it's looking a little bit scary for them. Mistralton, of course, sitting at 8-6 at that number 4 spot. 2-1 on the week, wasn't able to get the big upset over New Moon, which really would have thrown the standings into disarray, but they're still sitting pretty, a sizable gap between them and the rest of the wildcard contenders. Humalao currently holds that number 5 spot at 6-7-1, went 1-1-1 on the week, had to draw against Nat Green City. Was a winnable matchup. That's going to be very interesting down the stretch as well. We will see if that ends up sinking Humalao's chances of moving into a top 3 spot, or potentially even cost them a wildcard spot at all, because of course Hard Home is right on their tail, sitting at 6-8. They went 2-1 on the week after that big upset over New Moon, so they are still very well in contention for a playoff spot. Humalao does have the head-to-head tiebreaker on Heart Home, but they have only played once, so that is going to be very important down the stretch. There is some separation between Heart Home and the other 2 teams in the Sapphire League. Nat Green City sitting at 4-9-1 after an 0-2-1 week, so an opportunity for them to gain some ground in that wild card race is starting to slip away. And then Little Root with another winless week. They have now lost 7 sets in a row. They also sit at 3-11. Could still potentially avoid that relegation match, but it's starting to look very grim for them as well. Looking into the power ranking for the upcoming week, Ambertown and Sir Chester still hold the top 2 spots. Of course, the gap is closing a little bit, but for the time being, they still are considered the top 2 teams in the league. New Moon jumps back up to number 3 after breaking away from the top of the Sapphire League just a little bit. Mauville, of course, on their tails, moving up to number 4, while Kitakami drops down to number 5. Still the top 3 teams in the Sapphire League, holding 3, 4, and 5. Mistralton now moves up to number 6, their highest placement of the season after a good week, and they currently sit as the 6th best record in the entire league. Mount Coronet moves up to number 7, jumping over Humalao, who drops to 8 after their mediocre week. Koroway and Sicily move up to 9 and 10, reflecting their spot in the Ruby League standings. Sunny Shore, despite their good week, standing pat at 11, considering that they lost the head-to-head to Sicily and Corway, is still outplaying them. Hard Home, of course, also had a solid week, but will sit at 12, considering the teams above them as well. Veilstone drops down to 13, their lowest placement of the season thus far. Nacreen City dropping to 14, Little Root dropping to 15, and Black City dropping to 16. All of those teams dropping to replace Sicily, who moved all the way up from the bottom spot to number 10. Another week of the stats leaderboard, another week where Titan tops the charts, once again leading the league in KOs and points. At this juncture, that is now 4 for 4, in which Titan has led the league in both categories over the course of a single week. Basque Legion Female comes in second place in KOs and tied for third place in points with 14 and 24 apiece. Iron Thorns comes in third in KOs and second in points with 13 and 25. It shares that 13 KO total with Toxtricity of Corway, who shares the 24 point total with Basque Legion Female. The fifth place tie for KOs comes courtesy of Slitherwing of Veilstone, Keldeo of New Moon, and Pawmot of Sunny Shore. Lander Starion tops the assist leaderboard for the second week in a row, this time putting up 8 on the week. And then a 4-way tie at second place with 6 between Ting Lu of Sir Chester, Don Fan of Humalau, Ogre Pond Cornerstone of Mauville, and Overquill of New Moon. In the per game category, Bisharp of Kitakami makes an appearance, putting up 7.5 points per game and 3.5 KOs per game this week. Only played one set, but when you put up numbers like that, that'll get you the top of the leaderboard. Toxtricity was very efficient in its great week, with 6.0 points per game and 3.3 KOs per game, both good for second in the league. It shares that 6.0 points per game mark with Haxorus of Humalau, the second week in a row that mon has been in the top 5 of the per game list. It also put up a flat 3 KOs per game, which was good for third place in that category. The aforementioned Iron Thorns finished 4th on the week with 4.2 points per game and 5th in KOs per game with 2.2. Iron Moth of Sicily comes in 5th place for points per game with a flat 4. And then the aforementioned Titan coming in 4th place in KOs per game with 2.2. Now look, we're sure a lot of you are tired of seeing the same Pokemon win Pokemon of the Week. But let's be honest, if a Pokemon is on a absolutely generational run and is on pace to demolish every record in the record books, would it not make sense for that mon to continually win Pokemon of the Week? So Titan shows up for the 4th time in a row, once again leading the league in KOs and points on the week. Its 3.7 points per game were still very high, and its 2.2 KOs per game were second in the Ruby League over the course of the week. Again, there's not much to say. It's again a question of whether or not this mon is going to start getting banned or not. What is notable is that Titan has now broken the all-time KO record in a single season and needs quite literally one more point to break the all-time points record in NWBA history. Now, typically in week 4 you see a drop in numbers because teams go back to playing 3 sets instead of 4, so the numbers aren't necessarily as high, but that does not mean that the Pokemon of the Week winners are any less deserving. And this week in the Sapphire League, it goes to Keldeo of the New Moon Dark Rise. 12 KOs and 22 points were both second in the Sapphire League, and 3.1 points per game and 1.7 KOs per game were both top 10 over the course of the entire league for the week. Ever so slightly edged out Basque Legion Female for this award. The numbers were extremely similar, but Keldeo was more efficient, which is why it got the award this week. And pretty notably too, because Keldeo has not had a very strong season, has not played a lot of games for New Moon, but this week showed up, showed out, walked away with a Pokemon of the Week award. And of course, seeing as how we are now in the back half of the season, it's time to bring back the NWBA.com race to the MVP ladder. Of course, we look at the top 5 MVP candidates on the season for each league and monitor them closely down the stretch, adjusting them on a weekly basis. Over in the Ruby League, it should be no surprise who is the #1 candidate. It would take an absolute miracle for Titan to not win this award. But that does not mean that there aren't other worthy Pokemon contending for the MVP. Iron Thorns of Sirchester clocks in at #2. It has been the most effective sweeper on this team, especially considering that it was a free agent pickup midway through the season. So its numbers have been fantastic for the second best team in the league up to this point. Gliscor has been the leading man on Mount Coronet. As such, it currently sits at #3. One of the most efficient Pokemon as well. Very high up on the per game leaderboards for the entire league. Landorus Therian clocks in at #4 for Coralway. A bit of an interesting case considering that Landorus Therian was not on this roster for much of the season, but it was a very integral part of Mauville's roster before getting traded, and its assist numbers continue to skyrocket under Coralway's direction. Would not be surprised to see this one fall off a little bit, but if King leans into using Landorus T more offensively as season goes on, you are likely to see Landorus T climb up the ladder instead. Slitherwing has been the most important part of Veilstone's offense at this juncture of the season, which is why it currently sits at #5, had a fantastic week last week, and is now among the league leaders in points in total. Over in the Sapphire League, a bit more of an interesting story. Of course, there's no runaway MVP candidate, and the #1 and #3 candidates in the Sapphire League belong to the same team. Mauville has, for the time being, the projected MVP winner in Ogerpon. Cornerstone has been a real thorn in people's sides. Very high in the KOs department, top 3 on the league in points, has double-digit assists already. Basket Legion Female clocking it at #3, a similar case, a few more KOs, but notably less assists. But there is always potential for those two mons to end up taking MVP votes away from each other. And sandwiched in between them, one of the most interesting MVP cases we've ever seen. Umbreon of Mistralton has somehow found its way into the top 5 in the league in both points and KOs. We are talking about a Pokemon that is purely defensive. Some of you may remember from last season, Wochen got a lot of shine during the All-Star voting process because of how good it had been defensively for one of the best teams in the league. And while Mistralton is no Fuchsia City, Umbreon has completely lapped Wochen as far as actual usefulness. The fact that a purely defensive mon has that many KOs and that many points in the season means that Umbreon has a very legitimate case of walking away with the MVP award in the Sapphire League. Of course, there are other notable contenders. Cresselia, another Pokemon that typically has more of a defensive profile, but CJ has been able to unlock a bit of a sweeping prowess with this mon, thanks to being a Terra Captain and the ability to Calm Mind. So Cresselia currently sits at #4 in the MVP race. And then, of course, the OG, one of the greatest Pokemon in NWBA history, Haxorus of Humalao, clocking in at #5. Similar case to Slitherwing of Veilstone in that it had a great week 4, and as a result, now kind of starts to creep into MVP consideration. Notably, New Moon does not have an MVP representative, but that is because New Moon has been an extremely balanced roster all season. But of course, with 8 sets still left to play, there's a lot of points on the table. Somebody could be making some major moves within the next 2 weeks and find themselves skyrocketing up the ladder and potentially take that top spot, especially in the Sapphire League. And of course, now we move on to our final segment of this week's episode, the look ahead to week 5. We mentioned earlier in the episode that the trade deadline was after week 4, and boy howdy were there a lot of trades done at the deadline. The most active trade deadline that we've ever seen in NWBA history, and the most trades in a season since season 1. The first trade of the week took place between Humalao and Veilstone, swapping OU picks in Silverledge and Primarina. For Veilstone, they bring back a mon that they are very familiar with. Silverledge was on the roster in Season 5 and was one of the more effective mons for Will that season. So Will able to use a mon that he is extremely familiar with once again. Humalao picks up a bulky Water Fairy type no stranger to that archetype, having used Tapu Fini in previous seasons, and Primarina functions somewhat similarly to that mon in Generation 9. That being said, Humelau is very familiar with bulky water fairy types for a reason, because Azumarill is already on this roster. So why would Humelau do such an odd thing and double down on the exact same typing on the team? The answer to that question comes in the form of our second trade. Humelau getting active again, this time trading with Koroway, swapping Azumarill for Sinistcha. This is another comfortability trade, so to speak. King, very versed in using Azumarill, was one of the more destructive mons on his championship winning roster in Season 3. So he, similar to Will, acquires a mon that he is very familiar with. For Humelau, in picking up Sinistcha, that offloads the other water fairy type on the team, so now Primarina is the only one on the roster, and gives Kobe the opportunity to use a mon that has very good late game sweeping potential, much like Haxorus. Now he has a special attacker to accompany the physical attacker in the dragon type. Obviously, we've seen Sinistcha be an MVP candidate last season. We'll see just how much usage Kobe's going to be able to get out of this thing in the last 2 weeks of the season, but on paper, a good trade for both teams, seeing as how Humelau wants to continue switching up the flow, and King gets him on that he already knows how to break teams open with. The third trade of the week, and perhaps the most lopsided one, comes courtesy of Mauville and Ambert Town, swapping UU picks in Slowking and Comfey. This is a bit of an odd one for Mauville. Slowking wasn't really doing too much on this roster. It is a good defensive water type, but the fact that it typically likes to pivot out with Chili Reception counteracts what Mauville typically wants to do with rain offense. Now, obviously, Slowking can just hard pivot out, but you lose a lot of momentum doing that. Understandable why Logan would want to get rid of a mon that he hasn't really used all that much. But we've already seen what Comfey brings to the table, and while it can sweep teams in the right circumstances, it struggles to do so due to the fact that it isn't very threatening right out the box. Typically better at being a little bit more annoying with things like Triage Lead Seed, which we believe is why Logan wanted to pick up this mon. At the very least, he thinks he can get some usage out of this team. But for Ambert Town, this is an absolute steal, because that aforementioned Chili Reception sets up the snow, meaning that the most dominant Pokemon in NWBA history now has access to run Slush Rush on top of its other two great abilities, and gets the defense boost in the snow. So on top of all that crazy bulk, now that mon gets even bulkier on the physical side. So this is an absolutely huge coup for Ambert Town, picking up a mon that can enable Titan to even greater heights. The last trade of the week was perhaps the most impactful one yet. Veilstone and Koroway, who are already active early in the week with Humelau, decide to trade with each other, swapping OU picks in Walking Wake and Meowscarada. This is huge because Veilstone's bread and butter up to this point in the season was to run Sun offense. Obviously, Walking Wake getting banned very frequently this season, but Will, figuring that he hasn't really been able to maximize his Pokemon's potential in the Sun when it has been available, decides to blow up the Sun operation entirely, swapping out Walking Wake to pick up Meowscarada, a Pokemon that is still very good offensively, just frailer, and obviously doesn't need the Sun to be able to make things work. Interesting trade for Koroway, considering that they don't really have any Sun abusers. We will see what free agency moves they made later on in the week, maybe to help that out, but for the time being, King deciding to switch things up again, getting rid of Meowscarada, and Will deciding to blow up the Sun offense that he had drafted so carefully around. So definitely the most surprising trade of the week, and definitely will have an interesting ripple effect on the remainder of the season. Now, just because the trade deadline was the focal point of week 4 does not mean that there were not interesting free agency moves made over the course of the week. Another week where we saw a lot of teams make a lot of moves. Starting with Mount Coronet, who had not been active in free agency prior to week 4, but made 4 moves over the course of the week. The first one was to get rid of Empoleon to sign Reuniclus. Reuniclus, we saw earlier in the season for Humalao, didn't do too much. Did have a good set against Kitakami, but ultimately didn't fit what Kobe was looking for. Earthflax opting to continue to double down on the I'm going to set up and beat the brakes off of your team mentality. Reuniclus, we know that this mon can set up. Obviously, Magic Guard Life Orb is really dangerous out the box. So getting rid of one of the few defensive-oriented mons on the roster to pick up a mon that can pick teams apart with the right set. Mount Coronet also got rid of Crawdaunt for Ursaluna. This one is more interesting for the sake of Crawdaunt fitting the mold of what Mount Coronet wants to do, but Ursaluna is the strongest Guts wall breaker in the game with Conkeldurr, who is already on Mount Coronet's roster. So now you have a team that can get really nasty as far as Guts wall breakers are concerned. And when you add Reuniclus into the mix, all of a sudden this team becomes a candidate to run Trick Room offense. We will see if Mount Coronet opts to run that a little bit more, but a lot of the moves that they make really benefit from that change. Littleroot opts to get rid of Volcanion to pick up Crawdaunt. Volcanion hadn't really done that well for the team. Is a very strong mon, but only really does one thing, and that's hits you hard on the special side. And because of the fact that it's weak to rocks and its typing is not the greatest defensively, solid for sure, but not outstanding, didn't really see a lot of playing time for Littleroot. So they opt to get rid of it and pick up Crawdaunt to just get straight down to business on the offensive side. Hopefully that will be a change that can reverse their fortunes for the last third of the season. Mount Coronet continued to swap out some defensive mons for pure offense, getting rid of Tatsugiri for Glastrier. Interesting in that Glastrier will not be a Terra Captain, so this thing will have to stay mono ice. We've seen what Glastrier's done in the past, but again, when you mention the aforementioned Reuniclus and the potential for Trick Room, all of a sudden this mon becomes a lot more terrifying because it is very slow, but hits very hard and has good natural bulk, much like Ursaluna. Humalao continues to shuffle around their RU picks, getting rid of Gardevoir for Armarouge, picking up a bulkier psychic type that can be a setup sweeper under the right circumstances. Obviously, weak armor can help Armarouge. Veilstone continues to undergo some changes, gets rid of Crocodile to pick up Volcanion, and because Crocodile was a Terra Captain, that means Volcanion is a Terra Captain. Will opted for Terra types in Ground and Fairy. Going to be really interesting to see what he does with this mon. Obviously, Fairy is just a good defensive type, and Volcanion has very good natural bulk. Ground being solid as well, but can also boost Earth powers from this mon. So, will continuing to shuffle around the roster after those big trades earlier in the week. Corway opts to drop Hoopa Unbound for Torkoal. It makes sense on paper after trading for Walking Wake, but Torkoal isn't available. Or is it? We will get to that in a little bit, but for the time being, dropping Hoopa Unbound, King just deciding that this mon didn't really fit what he wanted to do. Mount Coronet said, hey, that's exactly what we want to do, and gets rid of Galvantula for it. So, now you really see the potential of Trick Room on this team. After getting rid of Galvantula, instead of setting webs, Earthflax figures it's probably better to just flip the speed tiers entirely and allow for his team to now outspeed the other teams by virtue of Trick Room. Hoop Unbound, not the slowest mon in the world, but 70 base speed isn't that impressive. Typically it's a Scarf candidate, very good at doing that. Instead, this thing can probably spec out into being an all-out attacker under Trick Room instead. So now Earthflax doing a lot of roster reconstruction, and now there are a lot of mons on this roster that can definitely benefit from Trick Room. This is going to be a very dangerous team to face in the last 2 weeks of the season, if that is the game plan. King continues roster moves by getting rid of Inteleon to pick up that Galvantula. Inteleon losing an important focus energy set that it had in Gen 8, so King realizes that this mon doesn't really do what he wants it to do, and opts to pick up Galvantula instead, able to make it a Terra Captain thanks to having a lot of points sitting around. Make it a captain in Electric and Ice. Electric obviously is a good stab type to have on Galvantula, considering that its compound eyes are going to boost Thunder's accuracy up to 91%. And then obviously Terra Ice, because Bolt Beam coverage is king. So a good decision there from King. Obviously he has the option to set webs, but this thing could be a very dangerous all-out attacker, maybe Specs or so if he chooses to. Himala makes another RU change, getting rid of Amoonguss for Chansey. Interesting in that Kobe has preferred using regenerators, but Amoonguss having lost Spore means that it loses a lot of the utility that it brings to a team. Chansey at the very least has T-Wave, so it can also status mons, not that Amoonguss couldn't paralyze mons, but Chansey, one of the bulkiest mons ever, especially in the draft format, thanks to that EVO light boost. So Kobe going for a little bit more sure defense and wanting to get probably some more set damage with Seismic Toss than Amoonguss would typically provide. Will doubles down on getting Sun off the team by getting rid of Torkoal and signing Rhyperior. So now you understand why Koraway was able to pick up Torkoal earlier in the week. That was originally Quaquaval, but upon seeing Torkoal hit free agency, King decided to drop Quaquaval to pick up Torkoal. So Quaquaval remains a free agent, Torkoal does not. Will opting to pick up Rhyperior that Himala had earlier in the season. Just wanting to switch some things around, figured that Sun wasn't really worth it anymore, and wanted to switch up the flow, so he picks up Rhyperior. Amber Town makes a rare move for a team sitting that good in the standings. Gets rid of Suicune for Staraptor. Suicune had very limited playing time. It did well in the sets that it showed up in, but Aleph figuring that he would rather have a very strong out-the-gate attacker like Staraptor to just kind of whittle teams down the good old-fashioned way, as opposed to trying to play the war of attrition with Suicune. Will's last move of the week was to get rid of Venusaur for Cacturne, so just in case it needs reiterating, moving away from Sun and picking up a mon that he is familiar with did a lot of work for him in Season 5, made it a Terra Captain with types in Fire and Ghost. So this is a mon that Will is comfortable with, didn't really want to keep Venusaur on the roster despite the fact that it offers good defensive value to that team. Instead, wanted to go for Cacturne, who he knows can be very dangerous with SD and Sucker Punch. The last move of the week was for Blades and Searchester to get rid of Hitmontop for Oricorio Sensu. So that's the second time we've seen an Oricorio this season. Oricorio Pom-Pom was rostered for Veilstone earlier. Blades making it a Terra Captain with Terra types in Fighting and Ground. Obviously, we see that this thing as a Terra Captain can be very annoying because of the fact that it changes the typing of Revelation Dance. Blades making this move because he figured that his team didn't really have much use for Hitmontop anymore, was sorely lacking in special attackers, and fits the setup nature that Blades typically likes to run anyway. So, a nice blend of need with want in that free agency decision. Looking at the Week 5 schedule, it is a bit of a mirror from Week 2. Obviously, you're going to get the rematches that took place there, but there are another batch of interleague matchups to be played. Of course, this starts the second half of those matchups, so teams are going to play their 5th and 6th interleague matchups. So almost everybody has been able to play everybody up to this point in the season. Of course, there are still some matchups we have yet to see, and there are going to be a lot of interesting bouts against teams that are really starting to vie for playoff positioning, both within their own league and against teams in the other league in very similar situations. We've got a pretty loaded slate of key matchups for Week 5. Humalao and New Moon, the number 5 and number 1 teams in the Sapphire League right now. Both teams just half a game ahead of the teams directly below them in the standings, so this is a very important game for both teams. Obviously, more so for Humalao, sitting just half a game ahead of Hearthome for that last playoff spot, but still very important for New Moon to try to gain some ground on the rest of the Sapphire League for that coveted number 1 seed. Elsewhere, Miss Stroughton and Sirchester face off in interleague matchup. The number 4, the Sapphire, versus number 2 in the Ruby League. Don't always get to see two teams sitting pretty well in the standings in opposite leagues play against each other, so this will be a very interesting matchup for certain. As far as Verseeker is concerned, Sicily versus Mauville. Logan was Flair's coach last season. Flair has done considerably better this season than last season, so in a bit of a student versus master type situation, we will see which of these teams prevails on Verseeker. Obviously, Mauville, the number 2 in the Sapphire League, would love to gain some ground on New Moon, but Sicily, currently the number 5 in the Ruby League, so this is just as important for them. Stakes-wise, this is about as important as Mistral and Sirchester. Black City and Little go head-to-head, both teams sitting at 3 and 11 at the bottom of the standing in their respective leagues. Don't want to say this is necessarily a preview to the relegation match, but that's what it's looking like. That being said, we know that last season, Koskarafa was in a similar situation before they were able to make a complete turnaround and get into the playoffs. So it wouldn't be that surprising to see one of these two teams, whoever wins it, turn this into a launching pad moment. And then the heavyweight matchup, the main event of the week, Kitakami versus Mount Coronet, both the number 3 seed in their respective leagues. But more importantly, we've seen some jawing back and forth between these two GMs and CJ and Earthflax. Very rare to see people actually have a little bit of beef, so to speak, in the NWBA. So not only is this very important for playoff seeding, this is very important bragging rights at stake. So it should certainly be a fun matchup in a battle of two teams looking to remain in the top 3 of their respective leagues. That's going to wrap it up for today's episode. Thank you all for watching. I've been your host, King Vasser. Stick around. Verseeker triple header action headlined by that big grudge match coming up next. We'll see you soon.